Petro, government integration of the state digital currency.
Well, we're taking a look now if government should issue central bank-backed digital currencies for the benefit of the broader economy. And joining me, we have Gavin Brown and Richard Ells to take a look at this and more. So, gentlemen, first of all, thank you both so much for joining me on the line today.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to catch up. And Richard, I would love to start with you because focusing really on what Electroneum does do and the points that it covers, really empowering people through the use of digital currencies. What's your thoughts on a government-backed digital currency?
Well, I mean, the concept is great, perhaps. I'm not sure. I think the basic concept of cryptocurrency is that it isn't controlled by central government, and that's what makes it so wonderful. This is a decentralized platform, and as such, there's no central authority to make, let's say, some interesting decisions about fiscal policy. If you look at central governments, they always have a tendency to discover at some point in the history. Sometimes it takes months or years or decades or centuries, but eventually they realize that there's a money printing machine. And then they go at it as fast as they can, as far as I can tell. If you take a look back at what the pound was worth or the dollar was worth 100 years ago, there's been a reasonable amount of inflation, quite a large amount. But if you look at some other currencies around the world, of course, we've seen horrific hyperinflation. And what I personally like about cryptocurrencies is the fact that they're not controlled politically by any particular central authority. So if they come up with them, it's going to be jolly interesting to see what the maths are behind them, and are they going to be making them digital gold, or are they going to make them just a digital way of transfer? Haven't we got Visa card and MasterCard for that? So it's going to be interesting to watch.
Absolutely. And Gavin, I'd love to turn to you now, because if we look at Venezuela as an example and as a use case, it is backed by oil reserves in the country. So when we look at these digital currencies that are government enforced, that are then backed by real world reserves, what's your take on this from an economics standpoint? How do you view the structure?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a very interesting, again, always a very interesting use case to come forward. I mean, this is, if you look in the context of the Petro in Venezuela, again, slightly unusual in that this was a government sponsored initiative. This was government endorsed, but against the backdrop of the broader sort of global community, was very much something that was being done to try and generate additional value and create wealth in terms of the country, beyond that of the various restrictions that were being put on it, particularly from the US, but also by many other countries globally as well. So you can certainly understand why they wanted to do that. I mean, especially given that, this is a country with oil reserves right up there with the likes of Saudi Arabia. And obviously it was being backed by oil reserves, but not oil in the sense that it was already extracted from the ground and in a deployable form, but rather in a oil reserves in actually where the oil is still physically in the ground, which presents an extra layer of risk and an extra thing to consider. I think, though, when you look at the broader piece around central bank digital currencies, it is a sensible thing to explore, and central banks are obviously exploring it already. The Bank of International Settlements, or the BIS, which is almost the central bank of central banks, has already conducted various surveys and said around about 70% of global central banks are already actively exploring this type of technology. In terms of why they're doing it, I think a lot of this is about trying to hedge the risk around true decentralized cryptocurrencies. As Richard said there, that they're really, the decentralized argument is in that kind of community-driven projects and coin issuance and monetary policies. Whereas if you're a central bank, that's a direct threat to your existence. If these the likes of Bitcoin and various other altcoins eventually get much bigger than they are now, they pose a direct threat to your ability to create and manage monetary policy in your country. So it's a perfectly legitimate and sensible play, I think, to try and explore CBDCs, although they're still being done, apart from perhaps the likes of China, in a very cautious way, I would suggest.
And that's a really interesting point there, because we have at some point today, we have Dash joining us as well. So Dash and Bitcoin are other digital currency alternatives there, as you've mentioned, across Venezuela. And how do you think, and Gavin, I'd still like to ask this to you, how do you think a central bank should react then for a non-native digital currency that is coming and potentially gaining popularity in a region like Venezuela, which is struggling economically?
Yeah, I think the if we can call it a business case, the business case for a currency like Dash or Bitcoin or a similar sort of offering is much stronger, obviously, in a country where the fiat currency is failing. You know, Richard mentioned before about hyperinflation. You know, if you're in an environment where your currency is particularly volatile or experiencing hyperinflation or near hyperinflationary environment, then it suddenly becomes a bit more tenable and a bit more interesting to pursue something which is controlled by codes and not by politicians and monetary policy committees, etc. So I can certainly see why that then becomes much more important and much more relevant. Again, though, the problem is that to what extent will countries and those central banks permit these things to become regulated, and indeed even whether their permission is required. You know, is it the case that, similar to many other kind of broader political and social changes we've seen, if this thing happens from the ground up at some point in the future or even in the near future, then you know, that their endorsement or regulatory approval may not indeed be required. Although I'm perhaps not going to predict exactly what will happen there. I might leave that to Richard, although in the UK we call that a hospital pass when you give a difficult question to someone else.
And Richard, I would like to turn to you from a personal approach of Electroneum. Electroneum has reached into many countries where people are unbanked and are looking to kind of have some economic salvage, as it were. So from your perspective, how's ETN really combated this central bank and maybe this regulatory issue, and how is it moving forward?
Yeah, well, we've embraced a regulatory environment, and we're indeed at the sort of cutting edge, I suppose, of that in trying to forge forwards and make a regulatory environment in which cryptocurrencies can thrive. But we're a sort of a halfway house in many respects. That most cryptocurrencies that are out there that are pure, in essence, let's say Bitcoin at least. I'm not entirely too sure that I can say that about all of them, actually. There's plenty of them that would seem utterly decentralized, and perhaps they are, perhaps not. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come in the middle and say, look, cryptocurrencies can solve a lot of problems, and mostly that is being able to move tiny amounts of value around the world really, really simply. There are lots of other plays, of course, out there in the cryptocurrency landscape, but certainly from our perspective, what we've thought is, will a government, and we've engaged with a number around the world, but what a lot of governments are afraid of is what will cryptocurrency in general do to their economy. Now, a lot of people in politics in these countries are afraid of capital outflow. So cryptocurrency makes a very good, Bitcoin specifically, let's say, very, very good vehicle for exiting value from that country and getting it out somewhere else. And I totally understand these countries have had capital controls for years and years and years. So suddenly you've got a new vehicle for getting money effectively out of the country. Now, from our perspective, it's a really obvious use case that it's bringing money into the country. I don't think that that's enabled us at this point to be embraced fully by any government around the world, particularly. But what I will say is that they do seem to be more tolerant of the concept. If we are bringing value into the country, and I'm very careful to not say money when it comes to cryptocurrency, but if you're bringing value in, if you're bringing something that has a value into that country, rather than it being capital outflow, I suspect from a regulatory point of view, what do they want? They want people to be able to earn. Potentially, they want to be able to tax them. They want to be able to grow economically. So I think cryptocurrency is not just Electroneum. I think any cryptocurrency could be put into that situation. The reason that we've moved forwards the way we have is because we've embraced that regulatory environment. But at the same time, I'm a bit of a libertarian myself, and I rather like the idea of you being able to have absolute control of a decentralized project, and you can use it how you want, and the government can't do anything about it. But what you must remember is that in these countries, In the UK, if you did something, let's say you pirated some videos, that's illegal, and yet loads and loads and loads of people do it. They download pirate videos from the internet, even though they're not allowed to. There is a very strong regulation that says you can't do it. If you start using those, as you could get cut off from the internet, you could perhaps go to jail for it. But the reality of it is, in a Western society, you're not going to go to jail for it. A lot of places, they're quite terrified of the authorities. So, using Bitcoin they might genuinely think, if I use Bitcoin, a van's going to turn up and my family are going to be bundled into a van. It's very different to where you and I live. So there's lots and lots of things to think about. We're still such early days for crypto. I can see why they're all flapping around thinking that a central bank cryptocurrency sort of digital currency is the answer, but I don't necessarily think that it will be. They're still going to then have exchange issues and political issues. Can you use it? Would you be using a digital bolivar or digital any other currency to move money around the world or value around the world? You'd probably use another crypto asset and then exchange it within that country. So there's lots to learn yet.
And you've both touched on something a little bit there, which is very interesting. And Gavin, I'd like to turn to you and ask, from the point of view of Venezuela and the Petro, from a store of value, when other countries are considering it something which is a potential store of value, has the Petro accomplished that, or is that a challenge which they haven't actually managed to overcome, and a big hurdle, actually, if they are looking to have it as a circulating almost money replacement?
Yeah, I think in terms of from what I've read and the data which has come out of the country, broadly speaking, it's not been a huge success in terms of mass adoption and mass usage. However, what I would say is that it's not been a failure either, in the context that this is something that wasn't just an idea and talked about politically. It actually made itself all the way through to implementation and creation, which is a lot more than can be said for many other types of projects which either corporates or nation states talk about. So I think it's probably somewhere in between the two. I think it's, as we said before, it's not perhaps surprising that a country such as Venezuela was one of the first to do it. It made a lot of sense, given that it had so much significant reserves and yet was sort of suffering significantly economically and sociologically as well. It obviously made a decent attempt in the current political environment to try and extricate some of that value and create that value by the use of not decentralized, but the use of tokenization. As to what that might mean then for the legacy of currency and currency creation, obviously we could find ourselves moving towards, CBDCs have many other types of ways they can be created and designed. We could move back to an almost quasi gold standard type CBDC, where we have a fiat currency which is being hosted on a DLT platform, but with some kind of asset backing, whether that be a precious metal or something else of tangible and verifiable value. But I think the bigger thing around CBDC, just kind of moving on from Venezuela slightly, is the idea that that this only has relevance to economies which are struggling or failing in some way. Because you look at the likes of let's say in the US, about 6% of US households have no primary bank account. It's about 14 million adults across the entire population. So when, for instance, COVID came along and Trump and the administration started to issue checks being sent out to individuals in order to try and support them rapidly, they weren't able to do that very easily, because they still had a large proportion of the population was either unbanked or underbanked. So one thing that I find quite interesting is the financial inclusion argument around CBDCs, where it might not be a full CBDC as we might expect, but rather a digital bank account which is hosted by your central bank rather than by a commercial retail bank. Now, there's lots of negative implications to that as well, around disintermediation of the banking sector and what that might do if there's ever a run on the currency in some other way. But I think it does raise the general interesting idea around people tend to refer to this as digital dollars, and what that might look like potentially for an economy. And although it's not a cryptocurrency and it's nothing nearly as kind of free and libertarian as Richard was talking about before, at least it's a step in the right direction by bringing in the masses of people who are currently outside of the financial sector in terms of being serviced, not because of their own choice, but merely because of their particular demographic or the way the financial services industry is structured in their sort of country of domicile, really.
And that is a very interesting point, that typically you would link and associate the necessity and requirement for digital encouragement from government digital assets because of economic mismanagement, also oil dependency, like we've seen in Venezuela, also in Brazil. So the Americas really have been a prime example use case when it comes to this topic. But as you've mentioned there, the US, and Richard, you were nodding along about just the amount of countries which have a very surprising amount of unbanked population. So Richard, this is something that Electroneum also works quite closely with. This is an example for countries like Venezuela, or digital assets government enforced could be for other countries, maybe more Western as well.
Yeah, I mean, the term unbanked is an interesting one in itself because it leans heavily towards the banking industry, banking them. And actually, a little bit like other technologies where we've seen the developing world just skip whole technologies. Why not just skip the whole banking thing altogether? Well, why be banked? So you're still unbanked, but if you've got access to a range of financial services and you've got access to digital payments, you don't need to be banked. So it's a sort of we're not quite there yet, but you can almost live without the banks. And then you wouldn't ever need to worry about being unbanked because you have everything that everybody else has. You have the same facilities, but you're using it in a digital way. So certainly a local digital currency could solve a lot of those problems. But as you said, Gavin, the fact that it's sitting there centrally controlled, even if it is pegged to something. So let's, for instance, say that it's backed by oil in the ground. We've seen over the last few years a halving and then a halving again of the oil prices around the world. You wouldn't recommend to anybody that they took their life savings and invested in any one thing that's not diverse basket. So you wouldn't say, oh, why don't you buy oil stocks or an oil ETF, put everything in it. Because unfortunately, if you peg to anything, whether it be precious metals or petrol in the ground or oil in the ground, you still have a bit of an issue, which is you don't know what the global supply is, you don't know what the global demand for those things is, and thus you are stabilizing against something that is inherently unstable anyway. One of the things about Bitcoin that made it the thing of beauty that it is the fact that it's not backed by anything. It's backed by mathematical scarcity. So why is gold valuable? It's only valuable because of its scarcity, and because it's shiny, perhaps, and doesn't tarnish. So over the years, people have seen it as a great store of value because it's not easy to get more of it, and it will stay in its form virtually forever. So if we look at backing something, I'm not entirely too sure. A bit like Libra, where they said we'll back it with a basket of currencies. It's all quite a difficult thing to actually peg that down and say, right, what is it we're going to back it with, and how does the fluctuation of that not affect the people that are using the underlying digital currency? So again, something that I think people will be pondering, but it's beyond my small brain's capacity to give the answers.
And on the topic, because you've both mentioned some components there, so I would like to ask, if we look at a future financial instrument, we've discussed the Petro and we've discussed some of the benefits that it has, but also maybe some of the things that may stand in the way of a country and a regional adoption point. What kind of components would you expect to see? And Gavin, we'll start with you when it comes to a future digital cash or a future store of value. What kind of digital components that maybe we have a few that come from Bitcoin and a few from alternative coins, but what's a huge requirement in your eyes?
I think first of all, I can't see any meaningful digital cash which is adopted to a point where we would deem it to be recognizable. I think it needs regulatory oversight and regulatory approval. I know in the world of cryptocurrencies and digital assets, the purists would say that contravenes everything about what a cryptocurrency is. But I think when you look at which types of industries are regulated, it's the important industries, it's the safety critical industries, it's the industries across the world which are absolutely fundamental to the way we operate and live as human beings and the economies that we thrive in, hopefully. The world of money is high up on that list, and therefore I don't see it ever being adopted in a way, or any type of digital solution where there isn't any regulatory oversight or at least quasi-approval in there. So I'm very much interested to see what CBDCs can do in that space. That doesn't mean to say I'm anti-Bitcoin or anti-digital assets in that sense, or cryptocurrencies. I still think they've got, they are the forerunners, and they will probably still exist even after a CBDC or multiple CBDCs come into existence. But I certainly see regulatory oversight as being a key component. I can see a DLT type a platform being of use. I would imagine. So if I think about here in the UK, we don't have a formal digital identification policy, but something like we have here in the UK something called a national insurance number, which is individual to every person in the country of working age. I could easily see some kind of ID type system running in parallel on this CBDC platform, where you're able to take all the advantages which come from something like Bitcoin, the ability to host money, the ability outside of the traditional banking system, the ability to move money rapidly and cheaply compared to our current system, the ability to move microscopic amounts of money, so microtransactions, which are still viable and can be done in a much higher volume, but at lower value per transaction. But I think the thing that's going to bite, and the thing that will be different, is the anonymity. I think either a fully anonymous system like Monero, or a pseudo-anonymous system like Bitcoin and similar. The reason CBDCs are trying to exist is to combat that anonymity threat. And obviously with that comes all the kind of implications around taxation and the shadow economy, and obviously we don't want to get too down on cryptocurrencies, but that's one of the things that states are concerned about. And I would imagine that the identification being part of any future CBDC, and the ability for the state to be able to see what's moving where and how, is probably something that will persist in any CBDC that happens to be successful.
Very interesting points there. And Richard, just quickly, because we are about to wrap up, but I would like to ask you the same question on what kind of core components you would expect to see moving forward.
Yeah. Well, if it's going to be something that's used by the citizens themselves, instantaneous is a direct requirement. I can instantly hand someone a £20 note or a $20 bill. I can't necessarily instantly hand them a digital asset. So that's going to be required. Electroneum obviously built one, and that is what made it take off. So that's my next part, which is you need to get some distribution. So if, for instance, they'd handed out to every single Venezuelan citizen $5 or $10 worth of that digital currency, I would suggest that it would be being used and would be a much, much larger success than it is now, because you kickstart the economy with that. So get some distribution in there. But lastly, just so I wrap it up for you, is interoperability is one of the things that's amazing about cryptocurrency, because you've got access to the globe. Again, Electroneum, we're all about empowering people by giving them access to the global economy. So if you build just a local digital platform, whether it's asset-backed or not, it doesn't necessarily gain you anything. And as we've seen with lots and lots of projects, you have to solve a problem for people to actually adopt it and to use it. So some sort of interoperability. If you've got a US digital currency and a yuan digital currency and a Bolivar digital currency, you've got all these things. Someone somewhere has to make those interact in some way, which also almost gets back to this sort of exchange, the exchanges that we've seen pop up in cryptocurrency. So you need to be able to move this stuff around the world, because if you don't, it's not anywhere near as useful as if the things that already exist in Bitcoin and things like that. And anonymity is another whole thing we'll cover another day, because I think we're running out of time. But anonymity is a really interesting one, simply because anonymity isn't always about criminality. Sometimes you live in a regime where anonymity is actually protecting you. There's an awful lot of women that are empowered by cryptocurrency because their husbands would take everything that they earn, and it gives them an ability to have an income stream that is outside of the male control in the household. So there's loads and loads of reasons for anonymity, as well as the darker ones. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. And it's such a shame that we have to wrap it up, because I'm sure we could continue talking for hours. But Gavin, Richard, thank you so much for your time today. It was a pleasure to hear your insights. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure to see you.
Thanks.